I don't understand why people aren't more angry. When we look at the wealth, there are the 8 richest billionaires own the same amount of wealth as the poorest 4 billion people. So 8 people, and they're men, 8 men, own the same wealth as the bottom half of the world's population. That should make everybody angry, pick up their pitchforks and demand change. But it doesn't. We seem to be accepting of that.
Welcome to the 8 Billionaires versus the Planet episode, Time to Grab the Pitchforks, with Professor Mark Maslin from University College London in the UK. This was recorded on the 2nd of June following the World Meteorological Organisations report finding that the safe boundaries for climate warming are being crossed far earlier than scientists first thought. Mark moves beyond discussing the rate of warming to look at who is to blame and asking why are we not taking appropriate action? Why are we not angrier? In the next episode, I speak with ecologist and founder of the Ecosystem Restoration Communities group, John D. Liu. There are now approximately 86 communities spanning the globe, and John gives us an update on the steps they are taking to make resilient community-building knowledge both pragmatic and deployable in order to build a happier, more secure future. There's also another segment from the interview with John in the members area where he gives a whistle-stop tour of how China has achieved society-level wide transformational change over the course of the last 75 years. I'll also be uploading my interview with author Erin Sikorsky about her book Climate Change on the Battlefield, a book that I think should make us question the ridiculous sums of money being thrown at war machines, when in reality we need armies of Earth restorers from the get-go. I am uploading more episodes from the backlog into the members area as soon as I can. Thank you to all members who support the ClimateGenn project via YouTube and Patreon. Much appreciated. Mark, it's great to see you. Thank you very much for taking the time. 7 years ago, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, predicted that the world wouldn't warm 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level until 2040. Then 2 years ago, the IPCC predicted the world would pass that threshold between 2030 and 2035. And now the new data from the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO, indicates that the Earth will cross this point in just 2 years. We often hear the scientists talk about accelerating feedbacks and thresholds and how the rate of heating is speeding up. Is this what we're seeing right now? Are we being overtaken by the heating within the climate system?
So, Nick, I think there are 2 problems here. The first one is nomenclature. What do we mean by the 1.5 limit? So this was set by politicians in Paris 10 years ago, and they said, look, we're going to stop global warming getting to 2 degrees with an aspirational target of 1.5. Brilliant. But they didn't define what the 1.5 meant. So what we have now is lots of people talking about the 1.5 limit without necessarily talking about the same thing. So last year, 2024, was the warmest year on record. Now, different agencies are putting temperatures together. The highest one is Copernicus, the EU, who said that we hit 1.6. Now, if you look at, say, NASA and NOAA, it's closer to 1.5. Now, that means for 1 year, that year was warmer globally by 1.5 degrees than the pre-industrial. Now, does that mean we've passed the limit? Because we know that, of course, the temperature each year goes up and down, even though the long-term average is always upwards. This is where every so often, every decade or so, climate skeptics or deniers suddenly turn around and go, oh, look, it's cooling. No, it's just a slightly less warm year than the year before. So this variability kicks in, and the last 2 years have been much warmer than expected. So what the World Meteorological Organization has done is looked at predictions to say what is going to happen in the next 5 years or so. Are we actually going to cross this threshold permanently? And that's the key. Have we gone beyond it and never coming back? Whereas last year was just 1 year. This year is predicted to be cooler than last year. So it's about having a trend and passing that 1.5 earlier than we were expecting. Last year, that warmth surprised climatologists. The reason being is we weren't surprised that 2023 was warm. There was El Nino there. There was lots going on. That's fine. But it should have been cooling slightly in 2024 because we switched to a La Nina. Okay, that didn't happen. Now, what we think is one of the reasons is that we have cleaned up a lot of our industry, particularly shipping. And so therefore, a lot of the reflected material, all that dust and dirt in the atmosphere that was reflecting a little bit of sunlight, was actually artificially keeping the planet slightly cooler than it should be. And we're seeing, because we're cleaning this up, the real temperature being shown. We're also deeply concerned that one of the aspects of climate change that we know about but haven't necessarily really taken into account is the heat in the oceans. So the oceans cover 70% of the world's surface. And if you look at the heat capacity of the top 1 kilometer, so that's a huge amount of water, it's just absorbing more and more heat. And so what we're seeing is this just becoming a radiator that's giving out this heat that's adding to this climate change and this high temperatures that we're seeing. So hopefully that unpicks a little bit of why the World Meteorological Organization's predictions seem to be slightly different to what the IPCC were saying, say, 10 years ago.
You talked about the oceans there absorbing the heat. Can you take some of this language, as you said, it is quite complex, but translate it into things that we find more tangible, so impacts. Now, just for an example, we saw this glacier collapse in Switzerland last week. Today, we've seen these horrendous, the sort of full horizon fires in Canada. At where we are now, that's what we're seeing. And over the last 2 years, we've seen absolute catalogue of disasters. How does that all fit into this story in terms of where we're heading?
Key thing is that what climate scientists have been saying for the last 30 years is as you get warmer, things get worse. And we know this. We also had a report in 2018 by the IPCC called the 1.5 degree global warming report. And that clearly said the reason why the 1.5 degree limit is there is because between 1.5 and 2 degrees, a lot of things start to actually be impacted and a lot of things start to go wrong. So with this incredible heat that we've had last year, that seems to be the new trend in climate change and global warming, what's going to happen is we're going to have more and more of these extreme events. So we saw the wildfires in California. They're now in Canada. We've seen extreme floods all around the world. What we're doing is making extreme weather events a lot more common. And the problem is that we are, one, not dealing with the emissions. We're not actually reducing the emissions yet. So we're not holding climate change where we need it to be. And the second thing is countries are not spending money to adapt to these changes. We predict impacts all around the world. We can tell country by country what's going to happen, what are likely to happen, whether they're going to be floods, heat waves, droughts, stronger storms, but they're not able to adapt quick enough to those events. So the problem is that this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, and this is something that frustrates a lot of scientists is we have been telling the world about this for 30 years. You go back to the first IPCC report in 1990, and you read the very conservative language. If you read between the lines, it says by the 2030s, you will be at least 1.5, and these are all the impacts that are going to happen. So it's not like we didn't know this was going to happen. It's just now people are seeing it in their own backyard. And at this point, they go, oh, those politicians and the climate deniers, they're just lying to us. And I think that's where we've got. It's like now we've got people to actually understand this is real. How do we then do all those positive things to actually ameliorate and try to actually mitigate against the worst effects of climate change?
And that's really where we are at, because you say climate scientists have been warning not just what's going to happen, but also what we need to do to change it. I've seen you at various COPs and so on and so forth. And just, I think it was last week, the presidents of the last two COPs joined in with the president of COP30, the forthcoming COP in Brazil, to say we need urgent action on climate change. And yet all three of those nations are fully committed to expanding fossil fuel production. I mean, this is kind of just blatant hypocrisy. How do you respond to that as a researcher, as someone who has been saying this over and over again, and it's just more business as usual at a time when a WMO report also comes out?
I think there's a balancing act. The first thing is that a lot of people dismiss the international negotiations. So they're not worth the paper they're written on. It's too slow. But if you go back to, say, Paris and that 2015 agreement, by setting out 1.5 as an aspirational target and 2 degrees as the hard target, what it changed was the lexion around the world. Net zero becomes the actual main driving force. You hear companies, schools, universities, sports facilities all talking about how do we get to net zero. That's from a top down. And again, the interesting thing is that tore apart the politics. It said, okay, we're not doing this by country, some countries reducing by less than others. Actually, all of us, every single country, wherever you started from, has to get to the same net zero point as quickly as possible in this century. So that unpicked a lot of that sort of politics. The problem then is there is this huge inertia in moving away from fossil fuels. Now, the reasons are multifold. One, there's a lot of countries and a lot of companies making huge amounts of profit from fossil fuels. That's the first thing. Second thing is, economics is slowly eroding that because we know that renewables are much cheaper, much more secure, and easier to maintain than fossil fuel infrastructure. I'll give you the classic example. In Texas, heart of the oil and gas country, guess what? Over 50% of their electricity is generated from wind energy. Why? It's cheaper. Hardcore economics cuts through all the politics, and therefore that's starting to win. So again, we are shifting this transition away from 19th century technology, burning stuff, to 21st century stuff, which is generation of electricity directly. But it's taking time. And there's a brilliant book by Simon Sharp called 5 Times Faster. Now, you don't have to read the book. It literally tells you what the problem is. We are doing lots of great things, but we have to do all of that 5 times faster. And again, I think that's the transition. The transition is happening. It's just, will it be quick enough to avoid the worst disasters that climate change can throw at us? And the other thing is, why are we beholden to a particular group of individuals who are making huge amounts of profit from polluting the earth, which we're going to have to, as taxpayers, clean up and repair the damage? And so therefore, I think there is this sort of like corporate issue that we haven't actually addressed. We haven't looked at the elephant in the room and said, hang on, these guys are making huge amounts of money and they're doing it with particular political agenda, which is actually not in my interest. So, for example, the UK had actually gone full frontal renewables 10 years ago. The cost of living crisis that we all had to endure with huge increases in energy prices would not have happened. The government wouldn't have had to use taxpayers' money to subsidize the poorest parts of the communities to be able to afford their own energy. Again, it's one of those things, it's like there's a logic here that people are trying to avoid.
We're moving slowly towards the sort of renewable future. And as you said, it's all about doing it in time. And the forecasts or projections that I've seen say we're pretty much on track for somewhere between 2.5 and 3 degrees at warming, which is sort of double approximately where we are now. That doesn't seem that encouraging, to be honest. I mean, is life viable at that sort of temperature, do you think? Is our society viable at that sort of warming? How do you see that?
The problem is, let's just take 1.5. So 1.5 seems like a small amount. It's like, oh, if the temperature in my room goes up by 1.5, I'm not worried. But the problem is when it's translated globally, 1.5 isn't 1.5. What you get is 3 to 4 degrees in the Arctic because there's the polar amplification. You get weird things like in London in 2022, we had a heat wave of 40 degrees. Now, as a climatologist, we were predicting 40 degrees in southeast England in perhaps the 2040s. We got that in 2022. And I'll put it in context. It's July, and the peak temperature in July is 24 degrees. This is why we go on holiday abroad, okay? But this was a 40 degrees heat wave, so that was 16 degrees warmer than it should have been. So a 1.5 degree global warming causes a 16-degree heat wave above what it should be. So that's the problem. It's translating that 1.5. So 3 degrees is an absolute nightmare when it comes to all the impacts around the world. And the papers are there, okay? In the IPCC, if you want to scare yourself, absolutely, you can read what a 3 to 4 degree world looks like. I mean, luckily, we think the highest emission targets, which we're talking about 5 to 6 degrees, because of the change in global politics, because there are so many countries that are pushing for renewables and trying to do this switch, we've probably avoided the 5 to 6 degree sort of like apocalypse, but we're still looking at above 3 degrees. So we need to pull that down as much as possible. And I've always been struck by something that Greta Thunberg said. So she was being interviewed by the BBC and they're being hardcore, okay, as they should be. And they said, okay, what happens if we miss the 1.5 target? And she said, I'll fight for 1.6 and 1.7 and 1.8 and I'll just keep going. Because as she understood from the science, which is correct, every 1/10 of a degree matters and of course will increase the extreme events around the world.
The UK agency ARIA is allocating tens of millions of pounds into research into geoengineering, climate intervention to cool the earth while society tries to bring down these global emissions. How inevitable do you see this climate engineering route?
So, one, you have to unpick what geoengineering is, okay? Because people throw this term around. So, geoengineering is anything that affects the climate of the planet at scale. So, we're already doing that by pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So, massive reforestation of the planet counts as geoengineering. But also putting mirrors in space to try and reflect sunlight. So is putting particles in the atmosphere, and so is fertilizing the ocean. My viewpoint is actually the cheapest way of dealing with this problem is to stop the issue, which is emissions. So I work with a lot of medics. The best thing is prevent somebody getting cancer first. Okay? Prevention. Why not just prevent it? Instead, geoengineering is a little bit like a person who has unfortunately got cancer and you're then treating it with radiation. Okay? You're putting poison on top of the poison to kill the other poison off. And that's what geoengineering is. It's covering up an issue that we have created by creating another issue. However, as a scientist, I think we should always be doing this research. The reason being is because you never know what you're going to find out. And that's the beauty of science, because we call it blue skies, which is you may be experimenting something on sort of like geoengineering, which you discover something really important about the climate system that helps somewhere else. So it's again important that we do this research, particularly as I'm sure when we do the research in detail, what it's really going to do is go, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, because of all these issues. And I think that's really important, because unless politicians have the evidence in front of them that says, this is so dangerous, don't do it. Again, I will go back to the 1980s. And what was really interesting is the first early climate models were used to show the impact of nuclear war. And what they showed was there would be a nuclear winter, and forget about the number of people killed by the impacts, the winter would cause mass starvation of billions of people. That meant that science was given to the leaders. Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev came together knowing that science, echoing in their ears, and actually started to reduce their nuclear arsenals. So therefore, sometimes doing this research can lead to very different outcomes that you're expecting. So even though I think geoengineering, particularly some of the stuff that ARIA is funding, is ridiculous, dangerous, and in some case slightly mad, I also have to have my other hat on that says, as a scientist, we should investigate this, because you never know what we're going to find.
A previous guest on the podcast, in a more pro-geoengineering context, was saying, well, if you take stratospheric aerosol injection, putting particles in the stratosphere, we have an idea from the volcanic records of what that might lead to. But if you take 2.5 to 3 degrees, we have no real experience of that as a society, and it could be much worse than we anticipate. If the evidence that ARIA's funding produces positive forecasts for geoengineering, that it could be effective without causing more harm than not doing it, for example, would you support that, or would you still be, have the same sort of, we shouldn't do this?
I think that we need to do less to the planet. We need to think about our impact, which is huge. The human fingerprint is on every part of the environment, okay? And what we need to do is work out how 10 billion people, that's the peak by 2050, can live on a planet sustainably. And that doesn't mean sort of like burning stuff, making huge amounts of profit, still having sort of like billions of people in abject poverty, and then going, oh, but that's okay. We're just going to inject a load of sort of like shit into the atmosphere and hope that's going to counter that. Okay, that is illogical thinking. When we know we have 21st century technology that can clean our energy and is so much more efficient. So for me, the frustrating thing is, say the UK can go completely electric. Okay, now separate out concrete and aviation, because those are very difficult. So let's keep those to one side. So everything else we electrify. Okay, and we generate enough renewable energy for all of that. We save 40% energy straight away, because burning stuff is deeply inefficient. Using electricity directly, really efficient. 19th century technology, 21st century technology. It's a little bit like me saying, okay, do you know what? Let's not use modern medicine. Let's just go back to the 19th century and let's treat you sort of like that. It's like, this is the energy system. Why are we living in a sort of like a time zone which is like 100, 150 years away? So I think that's the mentality we have to have. And I don't think if we can clean up our sort of like mess, we can do that. And again, there are other technologies. We don't need to reflect stuff from sunlight. What we can do, if we really need to, is we can suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. We can basically industrialize fixing the climate. Okay, whether that's direct air capture, which unfortunately is very expensive, or just plant a load of trees, reforest the planet. We've cut down 3 trillion trees, which is about half the trees on the planet. So that would be a good start. Rewild, renature the whole of the planet, etc., for humans. So again, I go back to that medical thing, which is if you have a problem, prevent it in the first place. Don't get ill because otherwise you're just going to have some nasty interventions. And that's what geoengineering is. It's just covering up an issue that we can't be bothered to face and deal with.
But wasn't our prevention point back in 1990 when the countries of the world did get together at the Rio Earth Summit? And they actually said if we don't take this action, our human existence in the 21st century could be terminal. And we've kind of let it get to this as a collective, wealthy nations especially, we've let it get to this point.
I don't think we've let it. I think that we is very misleading. I think it has been incredible lobbying by oil companies, oil nations, fossil fuel producers, and there has been a delay. It's like the tobacco industry, except on steroids. It's like we are not giving anything. There was a brilliant play that's just ended in London called Kyoto about the Kyoto COP. And it is brilliant because it just shows that the oil and gas companies were right there, right at the beginning of the negotiations, undermining, playing countries off against each other, lobbying, spending money, making sure that nothing happened. And this is what we have. And I think it's really disappointing that humanity is basically being undermined and our future being sold out for a non-consequential thing, which is money. You can't take it with you.
But you've got this limited time, and the time really is just ticking extraordinarily close to us now. And you have the lobbyists that you spoke of, and the last few COPs have all been completely maligned, really, by fossil fuel interests. And the British government seems to be trying to move in the right direction, but it's going against the tide. And then you take all of that and you see them funding geoengineering. And as citizen X, Y, or Z, or whoever, you look at this and you say, right, well, these scientists are telling me that we can sort this out by stratospheric aerosol injection. But these scientists are saying if we do that, we're going to make the situation much, much worse. And the policymakers are saying, well, this evidence is a little bit inconclusive. It's either here or there. How do we move past this impasse? Because this is literally pretty much what's going to happen, it seems like.
Yeah, because I think the clearest science is that if you don't emit greenhouse gases in the atmosphere doesn't warm up. That is the best science. So therefore, none of this sort of like problems occur with just going, okay, let's just stop emitting greenhouse gases. And I think sometimes we are pessimistic because of where we are, but the economy is changing in the world towards renewable energy. We have countries like China taking climate change very seriously, and they don't have to worry about being lobbied and basically being paid off by the fossil fuel companies. If they decide to do something, they will do it. We have the UK that has bounced back and decided to be a climate change leading nation. I mean, the big energy push now is that by 2030, 95% of our electricity will be from renewable energy sources. That's just in 5 years. Now, again, they may not make it, but if they make 88%, that will be incredible. So it's again, I'm not going to hold them to that 95. If they make it up to 90, I'm going to be sort of like shouting from the rooftops to show that it's possible. And again, I think that's what we need. We need to think much more positively about how do we improve society for everyone, not just those companies and those lobbyists and those politicians that are making a huge amount of money, particularly as they're not the generation that are going to have to deal with the consequences. We have certain politicians who probably won't be around in 20 years' time to look at the consequences of their delaying action.
And that's really a key point. I mean, as a researcher yourself, you interface with a lot of younger researchers who really will have to be facing this for, their whole careers and talking to other colleagues in places like India or Bangladesh or wherever who are on the front lines of these things. How do they internalize this? How are they seeing it in terms of, what's your general feeling from that sort of perspective?
I feel really bad to vocalize what the youth think and feel. I'm always struck by how brilliant it is to go to the climate meetings, to see that youth delegation. They are incredibly smart, they're incredibly eloquent, and they know what needs to be done. And I think the one thing that comes across is the frustration with our generation and the older generation for not fixing the problem and leaving them with this mess. And I think that is through and through. We know that climate anxiety is a real thing, being recognized by Royal College of Psychology and things like that across the world. It's a thing. And it's important to recognize that people feel that they are powerless to do something. But whenever you go out and you see the incredible grassroots movements across the world, you see all the positive community action that's been taking place. You see all those young people and old people. Hey, look, I've seen a 70-year-old stick themselves to a bus, sort of work with super glue. People really care. For me, I think what is problematic is we need to change the way we think. And I actually thought that COVID was going to do that. Because what COVID showed was, did we miss being able to have 20 pairs of shoes or tens of t-shirts or multiple yachts? No, actually what we missed was being able to hug our relatives, talk to our friends, socialize, and do what we like, which is actually being that ultra social being. And I really thought that was a watershed moment, and that was going to drive forward change. But with the system reset itself, oh, no, you need to have these, you need to have all of this stuff. And I think that's where we come back to making sure we need to reset how we think about being humanity and what makes people happy. And it's not money, okay? It is things like access to education. It is making sure that you have aspirations in life. It's making sure that you have a job and security and things like that. These are things that matter to people, not being a billionaire and having a yacht. And I think that's something we haven't grappled with, but that is the key question of the 21st century. How do we become a global species? And how do we actually deal with the fact that we need to look after all the people, not just the very, very rich?
Especially at a time when the very, very, very rich are expanding fossil fuel extraction and not being too interested in the welfare of countries and, things like defense spending going up. And
I don't understand why people aren't more angry. When we look at the wealth, the 8 richest billionaires own the same amount of wealth as the poorest 4 billion people. So 8 people, and they're men, 8 men, own the same wealth as the bottom half of the world's population. That should make everybody angry, pick up their pitchforks, and demand change. But it doesn't. We seem to be accepting of that. It's like the frogs in the water. We've just been warmed up, and everybody been creaming off all the money, and we haven't noticed. And now we've got to this state and we go, that's how it's supposed to be. It doesn't have to be like that.
Mark, it's been great to speak to you. Thank you very much. And
Absolute pleasure, Nick.
we'll speak to you again at some point.
Take care, Nick.
If you are concerned about the future, then why not travel with me through every COP conference from COP21 in Paris to COP28 in Dubai by ordering my book Cop Out: How Governments Have Failed the People on Climate. In Cop Out you'll gain insights into what is actually going on in these supposed world-saving conferences and how we have ended up in this dire era of dangerous consequences. You can order Cop Out via the link in the notes or on any online bookstore worldwide in paperback or audio version.